Hi everybody, Keith Tanner here from Flyin Miata, and today we're going to talk about suspension choices for your car. Obviously this is a big subject. There's a lot of potential information here. We've done a bunch of videos in the past on things like how sway bars work, what they're, the concepts of sway bars, what they do, how to tune with them. We've talked about coilovers, about setup, about how to corner weight your car. So we're not going to get into some of the nitty gritty of that sort of thing. For that, we're going to refer you back to our YouTube channel where you can go back and watch all those at your leisure. But today we're going to talk about how to choose the right Flyin Miata suspension for your Miata. Because we have a lot of options. We do our best to make sure that they're easy to understand options, that they're clear, but I mean, anytime there's more than two, there's going to be questions. So that's what we're going to try to do today. If you have any questions, please do put them in the comments. We will address them live in the video if possible. If you are watching this in the future, we will address them in the comments as best we can. But if you do have questions, we will try to answer those as much as possible. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what a stage 1, a stage 1.5, a stage 2, and a stage 2.5 kit is. This is a little bit of terminology that we use to identify our suspension kits at Flyin Miata. We have stage 1 and stage 2 kits for every Miata, and they all break down into the same basic concept. A stage 1 kit is essentially springs and shocks. This is the basic. If you're just looking to put together some new suspension, springs, shocks, and if necessary, upper mounts depending on the generation, different shocks depending on the generation, but a stage 1, springs and shocks. A stage 2, springs and shocks plus sway bars, as appropriate for the spring and shock combination. So that's really the difference between a stage 1 and stage 2 is we add the sway bars for a stage 2. Fairly simple. The stage 1.5 and the stage 2.5 happened when we developed our extended upper mounts for the NA, and we had to slot them into the numbering system. So a stage 1.5 kit is a stage 1 plus a set of upper mounts in the rear, and a stage 2.5 is a stage 2 plus a set of upper mounts in the rear. We only have that available for the NA because that's the only one we have this design of mount for. So there you go. Stage 1, stage 1.5, 2, and 2.5 made clear, hopefully. Do you have any questions yet? Nope, I think we covered that one pretty easily. Okay, so now we get into the harder part. What suspension do you really want? And I'm going to start by talking about sway bars. I've done an entire video on sway bar theory. We've done sway bar installation videos. We've done tuning videos. Basically, we are big believers in upgraded sway bars and, more importantly, adjustable sway bars like these because they give you flatter cornering without a big increase in harshness, and they give you the ability to tune the handling balance, which is a big benefit for those of us who are trying to get the car set up just the way we want it. So we often recommend changing the sway bars. In many cases, it's the first thing we recommend you do if your shocks are in good shape. So one of the questions we had was, do you recommend doing sway bars? The answer is almost always yes. Now we do have a whole bunch of customer service reps who are very technically strong, who can answer a lot of these questions. If you have a very specific set of questions, always you can contact us and ask these. We'll do our best to get you a personalized suggestion, but I'm hoping I can cover a lot of that in this video. So, the spring shock combo. This varies by generation, but for all generations we have a Koni option using Flyin Miata springs and Koni shocks, and for all generations we have a Fox option, which is our flagship suspension, the Fox Racing coilovers. For some of the generations, actually I think all generations we have the Koni STR.T, Koni Orange, and for some generations we also have V-Maxx coilovers. I will mention that we are always looking at new options. If you are viewing this video in the future, there may be another option that is not on this table. That's fine, that happens. We are constantly looking for good choices to bring to the market. So for the time being, this is what we have. The easiest one to talk about first is the Koni STR.T. Street, that's what that stands for. It's basically a stock replacement shock. Now we do include bump stops with almost all of our shock absorbers because usually your bump stops, they can be improved if you have an NA or they have degraded over time with most other cars, and the NB or the ND, sorry, does benefit from a new rear bump stop. So this is basically a stock replacement. We don't sell this in a package with springs because we don't believe that they are damped to properly control our springs. Koni doesn't completely believe us on that one. They're willing to sell them with iBox springs. iBox springs have some characteristics that don't match up with our design goals for performance springs, but that's why you will not see this one in a package. So we're going to put this away because we're not going to need it. Okay. The next big question is coilover versus, I don't know what we call this, because technically this is a coilover spring setup. I'm not even sure these are from the same generation, but I'll put it together anyway. Oh, they are. Look at that. So we'll call this a non-coilover just for ease of use, but it's basically a fixed spring perch, and that's the fundamental difference. You can't change the ride height with this. You can't mess with corner weighting. What it is, it's a setup you can take, you can install, and you can walk away from because it will have the correct ride height. It will have the correct balance of travel versus spring rate. It's going to work right out of the box. A coilover setup, the only real difference, and I've talked about this before, is just the fact you can adjust this perch. They also tend to, but don't always, use an off-the-shelf generic spring, so you can swap out different springs if you want to do fine tuning for different spring rates. For that purpose, we'll often use coilovers to do the initial development work on a spring set before we get them wound, so we can play around with spring rates a little bit. There's nothing about a coilover that makes it ride better. There's nothing about a coilover that necessarily makes it higher performance, other than the fact that high performance shocks tend to be coilovers, but that does not mean that coilovers are inherently high performance shocks. The big advantage is the corner weighting and the ability to adjust your ride height, but you do have to watch out if you're doing that you don't put yourself in a bad situation in regards to coil bind, or that you're running too low for your spring rate, or there's all sorts of ways you can screw it up. That's the disadvantage to being able to tune things. You can tune them wrong. Do we have any questions going on over there yet? Nope, okay. So, we'll start off with the NA and B options we have, which is our affordable V-Maxx coilovers versus the Koni spring and shock combo. These come in very, very similar in price. And the difference is basically your intended use. Our Koni FM spring setup is a very good performance street setup. It's a sort of thing, if you're going to a track day in Laguna Seca and you happen to live in Pennsylvania, you can drive it across the country, run around Laguna Seca all day long, drive home again, and you won't hate yourself at the end of it. There's also the nice side effect that Koni shocks have a lifetime warranty. So if anything does happen to that shock, Koni's got your back, as long as you're the original owner. So this is a very good, I want to drive my car everywhere. I want it to be comfortable. I don't want it to drag its belly everywhere. I want to be able to do whatever I want with it and a lifetime warranty. Then you're looking at Konis with MM springs. This is what a good number of us run on our own personal cars. Looking around us here, at least half the cars behind me are on Koni springs, or Koni shocks with MM springs. It's a very, very good setup. Where the V-Maxxes come in is for the more performance-oriented driver. Someone who's willing to give up a little bit of ride quality for the ability to adjust the ride height. They generally come with stiffer springs. We have a couple of different spring rates available. They are basically, if you're looking to make the affordable track car option, that's a good way to go. And we have run these on many of our development cars. The cars we often use for taking people for rides, cars that we need to be able to change the setup on to do various things, we'll often run the V-Maxxes. So they're very good options for that. Unfortunately, not currently available for our platforms, currently. We also have our flagship, which is the Fox. Now these are not for the same, these are not for the same car. I just grabbed a bunch of shocks off the shelf, development shelf, which is why they're all dirty. Don't think that you're gonna take this out and put this in, please. This is an NC rear, or ND rear, which is a monster. It's a 12-inch long spring, and we have to package a 12-inch long spring because there's so much travel in here. If we tried to use a 6 or 7-inch spring like you see on something a little more like on the older cars, it would coil bind pretty much instantly. Watch for that if you're buying especially ND suspension. If they're using short primary springs, they're not using the full travel, you are losing travel compared to stock. So the advantage that the Foxes bring to the party is that they're very high quality damping. Their aluminum body sheds heat easily. They're very, very light. They're rebuildable. They're revalvable. They are adjustable for damping. Some of the V-Maxxes are. All of the yellow Konis are. And it basically gives you the biggest range of spring options. It gives you the biggest range of ride height options. It gives you the best quality damping, the best ride. And the longevity is extremely good because Fox, these guys make OE shocks for things like the Ford Raptor, so we know they stand up. Unlike pure race-only shocks, these things have seals that are designed to meet OE requirements. So they're very, very durable for a race bred shock. So this is the option of money is no object. That is a downside compared to the V-Maxes and the Konis, but it's what a lot of us that run in our own cars. This is my track car runs on a set of Foxes. That is the case with a bunch of others in here at Flyin Miata as well. Given the option, we will go for this shock, but it costs a lot more money, so that is the downside. Do we have any questions going on yet? Nope, no questions. Trying not to step on the Koni orange down here. So one of the questions I have in here is, what is the best suspension for blasting over railroad tracks? Which is, I mean, that's a legitimate question. That's something you actually do in the real world. And it's actually a really good test of suspension travel, because you end up with a hard hit and then all of a sudden you've got this big extension. The car's way up in the air. And if you're not damped properly, if you don't have enough travel, that's actually a test I'll often use to see if a suspension is properly set up. And that leads me to one of the big things that we focus on here in all of our suspension setups, and that is travel. And the reason is, it all started when we started developing a car for the Targa Newfoundland, which of course was over very rough roads, all sorts of conditions of pavement. And in developing a high travel suspension for that, we discovered it worked better everywhere. And Mazda believes in that too. I mean, look at the shock they put in the ND. This is how much travel they think is necessary for a stock ND. The advantages to having lots and lots of travel is that it allows the car's suspension to move, to absorb bumps, to be able to deal with anything that the road throws at it. And that railroad track analogy is one where you really feel if you don't have enough droop travel. When you're running, say, a two-piece shock that has a short insert in it, I've done a video on that, but you tend to have less shaft travel. If you have basically a short one that's been put together out of different pieces, you really feel as it checks as it goes over the top of the railway tracks. The car will take this little step, it'll lose traction quickly. When it comes back down again, it doesn't have as much shock to deal with landing that, with absorbing that hit, and then the back end comes up hard, and all of a sudden you're squirrely and you're in the woods. So that's exactly how the Tesla crashed on Pikes Peak. If you watch the video of Randy Pobbs crashing the Tesla on Pikes Peak a couple of years ago, you can totally see the rear suspension do that. Runs out of room and just woo, into the woods. So all of our suspensions are designed to be as good as possible for dealing with stuff like going over railway tracks. Anytime you're looking at high-speed hits like that, the Fox is always going to shine. That's what it's really good at. That also means if you're on the track that you can take liberties with the curbs, going over the corkscrew, for example. If you want to take the Zanardi line, you want a set of these under you. It gives you the ability to basically use a wider track than you do with a suspension that doesn't have as much available. And I mean, the V-Maxes are not as good as a Fox. They're half the price. Fair enough. They will struggle a little bit more on some of that, even though we've given them as much travel as we can. They will struggle a little bit more on things like those great big hits than the Foxes do. And this is another important aspect of suspension tuning, and something we focus on, is making sure we have enough spring rate to deal with the travel that we are given. It seems counterintuitive, but a stiffer spring can be more comfortable than a soft spring, because you've only got so much suspension travel. And if you lower your car, this is the wrong spring for the shock. Don't look too closely. If your spring is too soft, when you hit a bump, you're going to go right through all your travel and land on the bump stops. And that's not comfortable. That's a very high spring rate. It's a very abrupt change in spring rate. Your car gets a little squirrely on it because all of a sudden you've loaded the tires up. So you want to have enough spring rate to keep yourself off the bump stops as much as possible. And that's why our road springs like these tend to be higher rate than I think any other ones on the market. And because even with the relatively small amount of lowering they do, you want to have enough spring to keep yourself off the stops and to ride and to keep the suspension active through the entire range. And that's where you can get into trouble with coilovers. If you adjust them too low with too soft a spring, you can find yourself running out of travel quite a bit. So that's why setup is important on these. Questions?
With a Koni Yellow, what will be my final ride height with FM springs?
So the question is, with the Koni Yellow, what will be my final ride height with FM springs? Now, there's an important piece of information missing there. What generation of car is it? Because it will vary. We do publish the ride heights of the FM springs on our site for all the different generations. So if you're looking at NA, NB, and C, and D, we do give the ride height of each of those combinations. And those are assuming a Koni stock at the stock perch height. Some of the Konis do have separate different perch heights you can use to sort of pseudo lower it. We generally stay away from those because you are lowering the car without adding spring rate, which means more bump stop time, which means ouch. So all of our quotes are given the highest perch setting, which is effectively the stock perch setting. When we measure, let's see if I can get one you can see here. When we measure ride height, we measure from the center of the wheel to the top of the fender opening. And this is the same way that Mazda does it in the manuals. And the reason is because it's independent of what's going on with the wheel and tire. You could run an oversized tire and this would still be the same. You could have a flat tire, that'll still be the same. So we will always measure from here to here. So when you see the measurements of say 13 inches on our website, that's the number it's looking for. Okay. So one of the questions is in here is what causes the limited travel in the rear of the NA and MB, and does it come into play often if running 450-pound springs and shocks? So what causes it is simply the geometry that the Mazda engineers chose at the factory. I mean, that's how they package things. The factory shocks will get you as far as you can almost. You get into the point where you can raise it up, you can increase the compression travel a little bit, but you will end up with your control arms going into the subframe. A decision of the engineers at the time, I don't know all the reasoning behind it. It is definitely a weak point of the chassis. Mazda went very, very far the other way to avoid that in the ND, or in the NC. The NC had in the rear, I don't have one of them with me, but the upper mount is like a great big tall hat thing that's about this tall, crazy looking, so they could package more shock shaft in there. And on the ND, I mean, seriously. They package in loads and loads of travel. So exactly the reasoning behind it, I don't know. That is one of those situations where the more spring rate, the lower you go, the more spring rate you have to run. If you're running 450-pound springs in the rear, then you can run lower than if you're running 100-pound springs in the rear. Exactly where that line is, I mean, it depends on the weight of the car, the use. I can't give you an exact number, but basically the lower you get, especially on the rear of all the Miatas, because it's always the rear that's travel limited, but especially the NA and MB, you want to make sure you're running lots and lots of travel, or lots and lots of spring rate, to make sure you still have that functional travel. Question?
What is the effect of the double spring rates on the V-Maxx coilovers?
Okay, a good question. What is the effect of the double spring rates on the V-Maxx coilover? What that's referring to is the secondary spring here. And you notice it, you might not notice it, all of these actually have a secondary spring rate. And what this is some people call them tenders, some people call them helpers. I've seen them defined in exact opposite ways. Some people will say this is a helper and that's a tender. Some people will say that's a helper, that's a tender. So I'm just gonna say secondary spring rate. This is basically, it's I think 112-pound spring. So at rest, it's fully compressed. It's basically just a spacer. And the primary spring does all the work. Where this comes into play is when it starts to extend, when the shock extends, this makes sure that there's still some meaningful spring rate as the wheel gets all the way to the end of the travel, and it allows the shock to fully extend. We don't use it on all the V-Maxes. Some of them use a single full-length spring, depending on, I think it's the fronts, use a single full-length spring on the non-track, on the Sport and on the Classic. So it's all a matter of packaging, but basically it's done to make sure that you've always got some tension on the spring. Nothing goes loose, and you've always got a little bit of push on there. We actually do it on all the FM springs. If you look at these, it's more obvious on some of the other versions than it is on these, but we have a few coils at one end that are very close to each other. And those are actually designed the same way. They are actually designed as a little helper. They will go into coil bind at rest, and they don't do much. But when you are fully extending, they'll open up, and they'll give that last little push to keep that wheel on the ground. It can be done with the Foxes as well. Not something we've played with much. These things generally we don't need to do it as much because we're generally running higher spring rates and they have such long springs to begin with. This is mostly just here to keep the hardware from going loose if you are set up this way. If I was running a higher ride height, this wouldn't be necessary, but it could be done with the Fox as well. A little bit necessary or less necessary simply because of the sheer amount of travel available in these puppies. Any more questions?
Can you explain how to use the adjustment knobs on our coilovers and when to use them?
Okay, so the question is, how do you use the adjustment knobs and when? That's a good question. And it should be mentioned that the Koni Sports, the yellows, do have adjustment as well. There's no knob on this one right now, but these are all adjustables. The best thing I can suggest, if you have a car with adjustable suspension, is to adjust it. Play with it. Soften it all the way. See what it feels like. Stiffen it all the way. See what it feels like. There's no substitute for actually experiencing this. So that when you're driving the car and you say, "Ooh, the rear feels a little funny," you can say, "It feels like when I had it too soft." So then you know that you can go the other way. Or if you turn it one way and it gets worse, try turning it the other way. Generally speaking, my favorite way of setting these things, and they tend to be, all of these are actually rebound only, which means they only resist the spring as it's extending. Some of them also have compression built into it. Sometimes it's one adjustment that does both compression and rebound. Sometimes it's two knobs, depending on the coilover you have. We don't offer any of those at the moment. But the way I like to set them up is set them up too soft and then start increasing the damping slightly, because the purpose of the shock fundamentally is to control the spring, is to stop that boing, 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 boing that you get when an uncontrolled spring is just oscillating. And the shock is there to prevent that. And so what I recommend doing is start off with it all the way soft. Not sure why there's tape on that. And then gradually increase it until you feel the car come into focus. It'll feel floaty. It'll feel like it's not well controlled. And all of a sudden, it'll start to work. And that's what I think is the ideal street damping in particular. You can use it to turn it up a little bit further on track. You can use it for some fine tuning, especially on transitional behavior. Don't fall for the mistake of cranking it up all the way and everything gets all jiggly and you think you're all sporty because everything's jiggly. Really what you're doing is when you're jiggling, your tires are having trouble. They're getting all these variations in load. They're having trouble hanging on. So you really want it to feel like it's flowing as much as possible. So that's my suggestion. Play with it, take notes, learn. But the basic way to set it up is start off soft, keep increasing until all of a sudden things start to work, and then use that as sort of your center for where you experiment from there. We also have questions in here for rallycross. Honestly, we don't have the opportunity to do much rallycrossing around here, so we don't have a lot of personal experience with it. I have a hard time telling you what's going to be the best rallycross setup. The Fox should do very well on it. It does very well with rough surfaces. There may be regulation reasons why you can't use it. Koni should do quite well on autocross or rallycross, but unfortunately, due to the variation in actual surfaces you deal with rallycrosses across the country, and deal with how high you need to be or what you're running for rubber, we're going to have a hard time giving you good recommendations on that one, because any of you guys ever done any? I mean, we have a hill climb rally racer here, but not so much rallycross. There's any other questions in here? Now, there are certainly a lot of other options for suspension on the market. I mean, you can get yourself, in the Fox range, there are a number of other brands, some of which are trade more on their name than their actual capabilities, in my opinion, but there certainly are quite a few options out there. We would be happy to talk to you as to why we think this is the choice. One advantage that we have at Flyin Miata compared to pretty much anybody else is that we design and approve all of these suspensions. You know, the spring rates on these springs are ones we came up with. The valving on these things are ones we came up with. The V-Maxes that we sell are not the V-Maxes they sell in Europe, because we said, okay, we need different spring rates, we need different bump stops, we need to change this, that. So all of these suspensions are ones that we were able to modify until we said, yes, that's it, that's as good as it can get given these constraints. And so we have reasons for why we did everything the way we did. And we would love to tell you about that if you have questions about a specific application, about a specific shock. We generally prefer to talk about the abilities of our own parts instead of talking about the competitors' parts, because we have found that our competitors usually get things wrong talking about our suspension. So we're not going to talk about their suspension, because invariably we would get it wrong. So we'd love to tell you about the capabilities and the function of the stuff that we offer. Anything else over there?
Is a full alignment needed after a shock replacement?
Okay, the question is a full alignment needed after a shock replacement? The answer on that one is, if you're changing ride height, yes. So if you're changing your springs and your car drops by an inch, at that point you should realign. If you're just changing out shocks because you're still running factory shocks and they're blowing, and so you throw in a set of a Koni Orange to replace it, you don't necessarily have to. If it's been that long since you had the alignment done, you may be happily surprised by what happens, but the only time you really need an alignment is if you're changing ride height. That's the only thing that's going to sort of force it. Depending on the generation of Miata, you may have to touch some of the alignment cams as you take it apart. If you do that, if you mark them, you should be able to put them back in the same place. You'll get pretty close. So the answer is sometimes. So I think that's about all we have going on right now. Oh, we do have a question here on bump stops. Are the Flyin Miata bump stops specified? Are they OE or specified by FM or the supplier? They are ones we have chosen, basically. They are not OE. I don't think we offer any OE bump stops at all. They are ones that we have tried. They're a little bit longer than some because we find it gives a more gradual transition onto the bump stops. But yes, these are all ones we have chosen. On the case of the Fox, they're actually quite short because we're relying on spring rate to keep the car off the bump stops as much as possible. So we don't use a lot of bump stop on the Foxes. On the Konis, we like to use a longer, softer one. And then we have this bump stop that's used for the V-Maxx as well. So there you go. None of them are OE. Okay. Well, that's about all I got going on. I have going on for this. The short version of this is if you are driving your car everywhere all the time and you don't want to hate yourself, the Flyin Miata springs and the Koni shocks are a great all-round setup. They're the all-mountain option. They will work in pretty much every situation, and they're very long-lived. I mean, they've proven themselves over the decades. If you are looking for inexpensive performance, you're looking for mostly track use, mostly performance use, that's where the V-Maxxes, if available for your platform, come in. And if you're looking for the best of all worlds at a price that will make you sad for a little while, but you will forget about, then you can go with the Foxes. You will appreciate them for a long time. So they might cost a little bit more, but they definitely do the job. All right. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. We'll answer them later. The usual, like, comment, subscribe. We have all sorts of content like this. We release a new video every week, at least. There's install videos, all sorts of stuff on our YouTube channel, so I recommend you go check that out. In the meantime, my name is Keith Tanner from Flyin Miata. Thanks for your attention.